Canton Fair, once the pride of China's export empire, now looks like a ghost town. Empty booths, silent halls, desperate vendors scrolling their phones waiting for buyers who never show up. This isn't just a bad season. It's a collapse. Export orders from the US gone, down by 80%. Factories from Shenzhen to Shanghai are shutting their doors, workers sent home with no promise of a return. Trump didn't blink. 145% tariffs. Total lockout. The backdoor routes through Vietnam and Mexico? Sealed shut. And now, behind the tough talk and propaganda headlines, Beijing is quietly slashing its own tariffs, trying to stay alive without admitting it's already lost. The question is, how long before the mask falls completely? Red Square Part 2.1, the export collapse, China's supply lines shut down, 600 words. At the center of China's economic engine is one simple fact: exports pay the bills. For decades, this was the deal. Chinese factories churn out goods at breakneck speed, American companies buy them, and millions of workers keep their jobs. The Canton Fair, China's largest export event, symbolized this unstoppable machine. Year after year, buyers from across the globe lined up, placing orders by the billions. But not this time. This year, the booths stood empty. The orders? Vanished. Down by as much as 80% across key sectors like plastics, packaging, and textiles. Export-focused factories that once ran 3 shifts a day are now operating at half capacity or shutting down altogether. And the reason why is no mystery. 145% tariffs. A decisive move. Trump didn't just raise the price of Chinese goods, he made it impossible for them to compete. No matter how cheap the labor, no matter how big the factory, when your product costs double or triple at the border, the market disappears. One packaging supplier from Guangdong put it bluntly: I had US orders booked out for the next 6 months. After the tariff announcement, every single client canceled. All of them. And it's not just one industry. The dominoes are falling across the board. The paper products sector, especially cardboard and carton manufacturing, is in free fall. These aren't luxury items. These are the shipping boxes that carry goods across oceans, the invisible infrastructure behind global trade. And now, orders have dried up. Some plants have stopped production at noon, sending workers home early just to avoid burning cash on power bills. In the plastics sector, the pain runs even deeper. Without access to cheap US ethane and propane, the raw materials that fuel China's petrochemical plants, production costs have skyrocketed. Many factories are now operating at a loss per ton of output. Satellite Petrochemical, one of the largest private players in the game, has already slashed output by 40%. Wanhua Chemical isn't far behind. But here's the kicker: these aren't isolated problems. They are systemic failures triggered by a single move on Trump's chessboard. For years, Beijing banked on the belief that global buyers had no choice but to rely on China, that the world couldn't afford to decouple. But the tariffs forced a reckoning. US buyers started looking elsewhere: Mexico, Vietnam, India. And they liked what they found. The result? China's biggest advantage, scale, turned into its biggest weakness. The massive factories, the sprawling supply chains, the millions of workers, all suddenly too big, too slow, and too exposed. One toy manufacturer in Shantou confessed off the record, "We're selling liquidation stock at below cost just to survive." The American orders were everything. Without them, we're drowning. Inside China, the impact is brutal. Hundreds of thousands of factory workers laid off or sent home without pay. Young graduates, once hopeful for jobs in export manufacturing, now facing record-high unemployment. And middle-class families who once counted on steady work from the export sector are watching their incomes evaporate. Beijing's first response? Denial. State media doubled down on the narrative of domestic circulation, the idea that if America won't buy, Chinese consumers will. But that plan is already failing. Domestic demand remains weak. Families are saving, not spending. Consumer confidence is tanking. The math doesn't lie. The American market accounted for nearly 17% of China's total exports. When that door closes and when buyers in the US refuse to play Beijing's game, there is no easy replacement. The export machine isn't slowing down. It's collapsing. And the CCP knows it. Beijing still clings to the same question it's been asking since day one of this trade war. Can we replace the American market? Can we find another way out? The brutal answer is no. And here's why. This was never just about raising tariffs. This was about locking China into its own overbuilt, overexposed supply chain and cutting off every exit. The plan was supposed to be simple. If Trump slammed the door shut on direct exports, Beijing would quietly reroute shipments through Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Mexico, even Europe, hide the true origin of Chinese goods behind a maze of paperwork and third-country transshipment. It worked briefly, but Washington saw it coming. Customs and Border Protection ramped up inspections. Certificates of origin faced deeper scrutiny. American buyers were pressured to verify every component, every raw material, every shipping route. And when they looked closer, the back door slammed shut. One Vietnamese steel broker, speaking anonymously, admitted, "We had Chinese clients asking us to help disguise their products. But after the audit started, we stopped taking their business. Too risky. The US is serious." The crackdown didn't just block the back door, it exposed Beijing's biggest weakness, dependence on the American supply chain itself. Because here's the truth, Chinese factories aren't as flexible as they like to pretend, especially in key sectors like plastics, semiconductors, chemicals, and electronics. These industries are built around US inputs, not just American customers. Take ethane. China's petrochemical giants rely on ethane imports to crack into ethylene, the base chemical for plastics. Over 90% of that ethane supply comes from the United States. Not from Russia. Not from the Middle East. America. The infrastructure is locked in. Plants designed specifically for US ethane. Giant transport vessels custom-built for deep-cooled American exports. Beijing doesn't have the ships, the terminals, or the feedstock to switch to other sources overnight. Norway, the only other potential supplier, simply can't meet the demand, exporting less than 3,000 barrels a day, a fraction of what China needs. Beijing's retaliation? A 125% tariff on American ethane. The result? Disaster. Suddenly, the raw material cost for Chinese plastic manufacturers more than doubled, turning profits into losses almost overnight. Companies like Satellite Petrochemical and Wanhua Chemical began slashing output just to stay afloat. Then came the quiet backpedaling. Insiders at the Ministry of Commerce leaked that Beijing is now reviewing tariff exemptions on up to 131 categories of US goods, starting with semiconductors, medical devices, and ethane. But in public? The government insists there are no negotiations. The propaganda must remain. The appearance of strength must be protected. But behind the curtain, Beijing is quietly surrendering one concession at a time. This is the supply chain trap. Trump didn't just hit China with tariffs. He exposed how deeply Beijing's factories depend on the very country they wanted to punish. Raw materials, chips, equipment, high-end tools, components that can't be sourced easily from anywhere else. Beijing can scream about decoupling. They can talk about self-reliance. But the facts are hard to spin. When your plastic factories can't run without American ethane. When your chip assembly lines depend on imported semiconductors from the U.S. When your aircraft leasing, your medical tech, your raw chemicals all come from the same country you're fighting. You're trapped. And here's the twist. Even the so-called domestic, internal circulation strategy won't fix the problem. Chinese consumers can't absorb the scale of lost exports. Domestic sales margins are razor-thin. Payment defaults are rising. Retailers are delaying purchases. Confidence is collapsing. The supply chain is locked. The exits are sealed. And Beijing has nowhere left to run. Walk through the factory zones of Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Jiangsu, the powerhouse regions that once fueled China's rise as the world's factory. You won't hear the hum of machines. You'll hear silence. Production lines stand frozen. Conveyor belts that once moved thousands of products every hour now sit idle. The workers? Gone. In Shantou, known for its toy manufacturing, one factory boss stands alone in the middle of his warehouse. Shelves stacked high with unsold inventory. Rows of brightly colored plastic toys waiting for buyers who will never come. The banner outside reads, "Factory closing clearance sale." He shakes his head and says, off the record, "Without the US orders, we're done." This is not an isolated story. It's the new normal across China's manufacturing heartland. The 145% US tariff wall didn't just make Chinese goods too expensive, it broke the back of an entire economic system. The system that relied on America as its number one customer. The system that believed the flow of dollars would never stop. Now, with orders from the United States evaporated, factories are collapsing like dominoes. Small and medium-sized businesses, the real engine behind China's massive export numbers, are the first to fall. Injection molding plants in Dongguan are shutting down, their machines being auctioned off as scrap. Packaging companies in Jiangsu are folding, leaving workers unpaid for months. Textile factories in Zhejiang are cutting shifts to 3 days a week, laying off entire departments just to avoid total bankruptcy. The cardboard sector, the invisible backbone of global shipping, is bleeding. One plant manager in Shenzhen explained the brutal math. We used to run 3 shifts 7 days a week. Now we run 1 shift and only 4 days. If things don't change soon, we'll close before the summer ends. For these businesses, the so-called pivot to domestic sales is a cruel joke. Chinese consumers can't pick up the slack. The margins on domestic orders are thin, 1/10 of what exporters earned from U.S. contracts. Payments are slow. Defaults are rising. Many buyers demand steep discounts just to place small orders. It's a race to the bottom. The human cost is staggering. Factory workers, millions of them, are being sent home. Many are migrants from rural provinces who rely on these jobs not just for income, but for survival. Some head back to their villages, others wait outside factory gates each morning, hoping the boss will call them back for even a half day of work. A young couple from Hunan, both laid off from a textile plant in Hangzhou, told Chinese social media outlet The Paper. "We borrowed money to pay for the city dormitory. Now we can't afford rent. We'll have to leave." It's not just the workers. Factory owners themselves are drowning in debt. Many took out massive loans to expand during the export boom of the last decade. They upgraded equipment, built new lines, hired more workers, betting on endless American demand. Now, with those orders gone, the bills are still coming due. Banks are tightening credit. Suppliers are demanding payment upfront. Landlords are evicting factory tenants who can't make rent. The result? A growing wave of silent bankruptcies. Factories shutting down without official notice. Owners disappearing overnight, leaving behind unpaid workers, unpaid vendors, unpaid debts. Beijing's official numbers tell only part of the story. State media highlights isolated success stories of companies shifting to domestic sales. But beneath the surface, the data shows the cracks. Youth unemployment is at record highs, some estimates putting it over 21%. Retail sales in major cities like Beijing and Shanghai have fallen by nearly 10 to 14%. Even the party's own internal reports, leaked by insiders, acknowledge the growing social instability in factory zones. But here's the part Beijing doesn't want to talk about. When these factories die, they don't just take jobs with them. They take entire local economies down. The restaurants, the laundromats, the shipping companies, the taxi drivers, the schools. This is what happens when your economy is built on a single export engine and that engine suddenly stops. This is not just a slowdown. This is manufacturing collapse. And in the heart of China's export zones, the wreckage is everywhere. The collapse of China's export machine isn't just killing factories. It's destabilizing communities. And Beijing knows exactly how dangerous that is. Because when millions of people lose their jobs, it doesn't just hurt the economy, it threatens the very foundation of social order. Across the factory zones of southern and eastern China, the early warning signs are already there. Dormitories emptied out. Migrant workers packing up and heading back to their rural hometowns, not by choice, but because the jobs they relied on have vanished. The official numbers try to hide it. But the whispers on the ground tell a different story. One laid-off worker from Dongguan, a mother of 2, posted on Douyin. "I worked here for 7 years. Now they shut the plant down with no notice. We're told to go home, but home means no work, no pay, no future." And she's not alone. According to the China Labor Bulletin, unpaid wages complaints have doubled in the last 6 months across Guangdong province alone. Small protests are popping up outside shuttered factories as workers demand back pay. So far, local officials have kept these demonstrations quiet, sending police to break them up before they grow. But the anger is simmering. The export zones were never just industrial parks. They were communities built around steady factory jobs that funded families, schools, clinics, and services. Without those jobs, the social fabric begins to unravel. Young people, the so-called Ant Tribe, fresh college graduates, are facing record-high unemployment. Over 12 million new graduates entered the job market this year. But with factories closing and companies slashing hiring, there's nowhere for them to go. One university graduate in Guangzhou posted anonymously on Weibo. "I did everything right. Got my degree. Applied to 100 jobs. But nobody's hiring. Even the factories are cutting back. I'm just sitting at home watching my dreams fall apart." Beijing's internal circulation strategy, meant to cushion the blow from lost exports by boosting domestic demand, is failing miserably. Why? Because job insecurity kills spending. When people don't know where their next paycheck is coming from, they don't buy cars, appliances, or new phones. They save. They hoard. They shut down. In Beijing and Shanghai, two of China's wealthiest cities, retail sales have fallen by 9.9% and 14.1% respectively. In smaller cities and rural areas, the damage is even worse but less visible. The middle class, once seen as the stabilizing force of modern China, is feeling the squeeze. Mortgage payments are falling behind. Credit card defaults are rising. More families are pulling their children out of private schools, skipping healthcare, cutting back on everything but the bare necessities. And in the countryside, the so-called hometown safety net for unemployed migrant workers, there are no jobs waiting. Agriculture alone can't absorb the millions flooding back from the cities. The result? A growing sense of betrayal and desperation. Throughout the COVID lockdowns, Beijing promised stability. The government claimed it could shield its people from the global storm. But now, the trade war's second wave is exposing just how fragile that promise really was. What's even more dangerous for the CCP is that the unrest isn't limited to workers. Business owners, especially in the small and mid-sized export sector, are angry too. They're the ones holding unpaid inventory, facing bankruptcy, crushed by debts they can't repay. A factory boss from Zhejiang vented anonymously in a business forum. The government told us to expand, to hire, to grow. Now they tell us to sell domestically, but there's no demand. They tell us to hold on, but for how long? I'm not sure I can make it another month. This is not just economic pain. This is the kind of pressure that leads to protests. That turns frustration into action. That lights the fuse for social unrest. And Beijing is watching it all nervously. Behind the headlines of resilience and self-reliance, the truth is hard to hide. The factory engine is breaking. The jobs are gone. The anger is growing. How much longer before the quiet frustration boiling in these factory towns spills onto the streets? Beijing may not be able to contain it much longer. Beijing thought it had a backup plan. When the first waves of Trump's tariff war hit, the strategy inside Zongnanhai was clear. If the US shuts the front door, China would quietly slip through the side. Shift exports through Southeast Asia. Push products into America via Vietnam, Malaysia, and Mexico. Use origin washing to hide Chinese goods behind layers of paperwork. For a moment, it worked. Then Washington slammed the door shut again. US Customs and Border Protection turned up the heat. New origin verification rules were enforced. Products were seized. Shipments were denied entry. Buyers were held accountable for proving exactly where every component came from. The message was loud and clear. We see you, and we're not playing your game. One Vietnamese steel broker, speaking off the record, confirmed what many suspected. Chinese exporters asked us to help repackage their goods. But after the US inspections got tougher, we pulled out. The risk was too high. The dream of rerouting exports through friendly third countries evaporated almost overnight. But the failure to sneak past the tariff wall wasn't Beijing's only miscalculation. Behind the scenes, the real trap was much deeper. It wasn't just about exports. It was about inputs, the raw materials and critical technologies that China's factories cannot live without. The plastic sector offers the clearest example. Satellite Petrochemical and Wanhua Chemical, the two biggest players, depend on US ethane to produce ethylene, the feedstock for plastics used in everything from packaging to medical devices. Over 90% of their ethane comes directly from American suppliers. Not from Russia, not from the Middle East, from the United States. China's domestic ethane output? Barely enough to keep a single plant running. The infrastructure itself is locked. Giant tankers built specifically for deep-cooled US ethane shipments. Cracking plants designed for US ethane specs. Switching to another source would take years and billions of dollars. When Beijing slapped a 125% retaliatory tariff on US ethane, they thought they were striking back. Instead, they boxed themselves in. Suddenly, the raw materials they needed to survive became unaffordable. Factories began cutting output. Some shut down entirely. The so-called retaliation only made the collapse worse. But Beijing can't admit that out loud. Official statements remain defiant. State media still pushes the narrative of self-reliance and resilience. But behind closed doors, quiet surrender, Insiders at the Ministry of Commerce leaked that tariff exemptions are now under serious review. A list of 131 key product categories is on the table, including semiconductors, medical equipment, and ethane. Step by step, the CCP is walking back its own retaliatory measures, but without telling the public, because to admit the truth would mean admitting defeat. Meanwhile, global investors are already voting with their wallets. Wall Street funds, once eager to pour capital into China's manufacturing boom, are quietly pulling back. New money is flowing into India, Mexico, Vietnam, anywhere but mainland China. Foreign direct investment into China's manufacturing sector has fallen sharply. Goldman Sachs now forecasts that without dramatic policy changes, China's GDP growth could sink below 1% this year. The factory of the world is not just slowing down, it's stalling out. Desperate for options, Beijing has turned to the Middle East and Russia for alternative supplies. But ethane capacity outside the US remains too small to fill the gap. And with geopolitical instability rising, these partners are unreliable at best. The so-called escape plan has failed at every level. The backdoor through Vietnam? Closed. The domestic demand pivot? Collapsed. The alternative supply chains? Inadequate. And the global market? Moving on. American buyers are diversifying their supply chains, something Beijing never believed they would do. But now it's happening at scale. New factories are opening in Mexico and India. Corporate contracts are shifting permanently away from China. One logistics executive put it bluntly, if your main customer locks you out and your supply chain can't function without them, you're not in business. You're just waiting to die. This is not about trade policy anymore. This is about survival. Beijing thought it had leverage, thought it could outlast the pressure. But the trap was already set. No buyers, no backdoors, no lifelines. China's export engine is out of options, and the world has moved on. The great Chinese export engine, the machine that powered Beijing's rise for decades, is breaking down. Factories shuttered, orders gone, workers abandoned. Trump didn't just raise tariffs. He forced the world to look for other partners. And they did. Behind the headlines, Beijing is quietly backing down, lifting tariffs on American goods, begging to keep raw materials flowing. But they can't say it out loud. The question now isn't whether China's supply chain can survive. The real question is, how much longer can Beijing keep pretending this isn't happening? Is this the slow death of the factory of the world, or the opening act of something even bigger? What's your take? Drop your thoughts in the comments and stay tuned. The next move might decide it all.